I'm going to have a conversation with Dr. Paul Edmondson and with Professor Sir Stanley Wells, in which they'll reflect on the life, the performances and the legacy of Sir Antony Sher. And they will read some extracts that they and other people have written, and we'll also have a general conversation. So I'm going to start by asking them a few questions, then I'll ask them for some readings. Let me introduce them first. Dr. Paul Edmondson is Head of Research for the Shakespeare Birthplace Trust, Honorary Fellow of the Shakespeare Institute, University of Birmingham, and a visiting professor in human rights, Birmingham City University. And Professor Sir Stanley Wells is a renowned Shakespearean scholar, writer, professor, chief editor of the Oxford Shakespeare, former chairman of the Shakespeare Birthplace Trust, Emeritus Professor of Shakespeare Studies at the University of Birmingham, and Honorary Emeritus Governor of the Royal Shakespeare Theatre. There'll be more such things to be said, but I can't spend all this occasion introducing them. As I say, I'm so excited to have this opportunity to think about Sir Antony Sher, who I think one of the very first performances I ever saw was with my O-level class. We went to see Richard III. And after that, I read Year of the King. And I think my own fascination with Shakespeare was really nurtured by being introduced to theatre through such a spectacular performance. And that makes me wonder, it's a question both for you, Paul, and for you, Stanley. What's the first Antony Sher play that you saw?
The first one that I saw was when he played the Fool in King Lear. It was oddly enough the second time he'd played it. He'd already played it at Liverpool, but he played it in Stratford-upon-Avon in 1982 to the Lear of Michael Gambon. It was a very remarkable performance. It was rather a scene-stealing performance, almost. It was such a heavily characterized. Can I show you a photograph? I wonder if you can see this as your dog. Is that?
Oh, yes.
The physical transformation is quite extraordinary, and it's also very characteristic. He believed very much in the power, I think, of makeup, of changing his appearance and of conforming his appearance to his ideas of the interior of the person that he was portraying. Here he looks like Grock. He looks like the great French clown Grock. I'm not even sure whether it's wearing a mask or not. The word mask has been used of this makeup. He played it as a fool, as a clown, the fool as a clown. He carried a tiny violin, as almost a toy violin, which he scratched away on from time to time. And the scene, the great scene between Lear and the fool, when the fool is questioning Lear, he sat on Gambon's knee during that. There was a very intimate, close relationship between the pair, and a very touching one. And he rather chaffed Lear, made fun of him there. Very touching performance, and it was very touching also in his final moments, because he was killed. This was a production in which the Fool's last words, and I go to bed at noon, were interpreted at their fullest extent as I'm about to die, and he did. He plunged into a barrel, as I remember, and was seen no more, of course. So that was a remarkable introduction to his art. But I saw many other performances since then, and I wrote about some of them. I was regularly reviewing for the Times Literary Supplement, and I wrote reviews of that Lear performance, and also of the next great one that I saw, Richard III. I've also written about Antony Sher in my book, Great Shakespeare Actors, and I'll be quoting a bit from that in what goes on, if that's all right with you.
Splendid. Yes, wonderful. Gosh, so was it in the light of seeing that production that you got to know him, or what's the story of your meeting Tony Sher?
Um, no, I can't claim to have known him particularly well, but he studied me in a sense because he was commissioned by the Shakespeare Birthplace Trust to paint my portrait for my 80th birthday about 80 years ago. And I remember him then, of course, when he came to see me in my study at the Shakespeare Centre. He was as interested in my chair as in me. I had a remarkable Victorian armchair which was falling to pieces. The stuffing was coming out of it. And Tony immediately lit upon this and plonked me down in it and looked at me, observed me very carefully with a camera, taking photographs and spending time studying my physiognomy as well as the appearance of the chair. I'm sorry to say is no more. In the pandemic, it suffered from the moth and had to be destroyed. It had a life of its own, that chair. But Tony was obviously fascinated by it. He'd been commissioned to paint my portrait, and he did. And the portrait now hangs in the currently largely disused Shakespeare Centre in Stratford-upon-Avon.
Mhm. That makes me wonder to what extent, and that's an amazing story, Stanley. How important do you think his eye as an artist or his visual side was to his performances?
I think it was very important. He clearly had eyes were terribly important to him. In any performance, the eyes stuck out, as it were. He writes interestingly in his autobiography about how Terry Hands, the great director, encouraged him to use his eyes more. And certainly, whenever you've read about that, whenever you see a film of a performance by him, for example, there are also very interesting, of course, DVDs of his performances, or several, you see what remarkable use he was able to make of his eyes, staring sometimes very, very powerfully. Do you want to come in on Macbeth, Paul?
Well, since we're talking about eyes, I mean, Macbeth was not the first performance I saw Sir Tony in, but oh my goodness, I really, really liked that production of Macbeth. I've seen two, what I would think of as great Macbeths, among the many Macbeths I've seen. And one was Patrick Stewart, but before that was Tony Sher. He's one of the great Macbeths I've seen. And there is a photograph which I used to see every day in the Shakespeare Centre of Tony leaning forward and staring with his quite near together eyes, mesmerically to the camera. And Harriet Walter, who is his Lady Macbeth, standing just behind him, looking terrified at the fact that he was so transfixed and hypnotised himself by something. And it's mesmerising, the way he was able to fix his eyes on an audience. I think he had eyes for tragedy. And I think that his staring as an actor and his ability to do that and hold our attention. And when you watch him on DVD, it's interesting to see how little he blinks, even though these are DVDs of live performances. I think he sort of lets us into that stare as well as, and then enables us perhaps to stare at what he's staring at. I could say more about this, but I think part of his hallmark of being a great actor is his ability to inspire empathy in us. And we can perhaps explore that a bit more. But I think he lets us in with those eyes, and he sort of challenges us at the same time. It's a kind of hospitable gesture, but it's not a comfortable one. It's not necessarily comfortable hospitality, and it's got that wonderful edge for the audience, which keeps us alive in the theatre, keeps us wanting to know more about this person. What's he going to do next?
Yeah, and direct address to the audience was, I think, a characteristic of his acting. The second great performance of his that I saw was The Richard III, and that was a really outstanding performance. And I have a very vivid memory there of his first appearance when he came from the looming out of the shadows of the stage, very elaborate stage set. It was directed almost Victorian in its style, with church music going on, and Tony Sher came forward to the audience on elbow crutches. Clearly, great physical effort had to be made there, staring at the audience. And this was a very remarkable beginning to an extraordinary performance. Can I read you a bit about what I wrote about it? I said, I remarked on the thrill of his first entry. As costumed in black, he emerged from the backstage shadows, swinging menacingly toward us on a pair of adeptly managed elbow crutches. It was a physically very taxing thing to do, I'm sure. His hump displayed as if in a kind of inverted pride. Short, curly-headed, he looked like a spindle-legged, knock-kneed caricature of Henry Irving. His rapid, jerky movements suggested hyperactive mental activity. He exhibited a capacity to charm and fascinate, as well as to appall, and his encounters with Lady Anne were highly erotic. Was ever woman in this humour wooed? He spoke that to the audience with aggressive, contemptuous malevolence. Irony rather than emotion governed his actions. The play was treated, I felt, as an ironic tragedy, not as a sort of first study for the Macbeth, which Paul and I too so greatly admired. And I remember particularly the closing scenes when comedy almost turned into farce. He was carried in on a portable throne for the battle scenes, and he had himself turned rapidly from one direction to another by the soldiers who were manipulating this throne in response to his mother's rebukes. But he was shaken by her curse. His tongue flicked in and out like a reptile's as he tried to regain his equilibrium. And there was pathos in his final deformed, dismounted, blood-stained helplessness as Richmond stabbed him from behind through his corselet, and his body rocked from side to side before toppling over sideways to the ironic sound of a Gloria. It was a great performance, and one which had an enormous impact. He writes about this when he's talking in The Year of the King, and about how this became an iconic performance, to use an over-fashionable word. People came from far and wide to see him. So those were some of my early memories of him. His Tamburlaine was very thrilling too, and that was the most athletically astounding performance. I remember particularly a moment when he made an entry from it was in the Swan Theatre, made an entry from the gallery above on a rope, swinging down on a rope like an ape. He writes himself in his memoirs about what he calls that a cocaine-fueled moment, actually, how he had to nerve himself up to it with drugs in order to achieve that.
There's a photograph of him as Richard III here in his memoir, Beside Myself. He writes about thinking about the crutches and mentioning these to Bill Alexander. And Bill not liking the idea immediately, because how would a man with a disability be able to be a soldier, was the question in the director's mind. And they really had to think about this very carefully. I'll just read you a little bit from that moment in the memoir. Tony realizes that by having underarm crutches, the designer made it look as though he had 6 legs, the tails of his coat, his own legs, and the crutches. So they achieved this bottled spider appearance. But what of Bill's initial point? How does Richard go into battle with crutches? Well, yes, he is vulnerable. Play his deformity any way you choose, and he is vulnerable. He's a disabled man going to war. Our solution is to transfer him from the crutches onto a horse, a huge armour-coated horse structure, which is then carried by his soldiers like they've carried him on the beer throne. When this horse is shot from under him in battle, he's definitely in trouble. And Shakespeare has provided the appropriate reaction. A horse, my kingdom for a horse. We will certainly earn the right to say that line. And he writes, and Tony was very modest in person. And
Yeah.
you know, when he's reflecting with pleasure on his achievements, with huge justification in order to do so, it's a delight to read, because you know that he's having to pull it up from somewhere, because he was so modest in the way he was, and so generous to other people. But it really mattered to him that the Richard III was an enormous success.
Yeah.
We're a hit, he writes, beyond wildest dreams. Every time I start a new project, my two Geminian halves go to war. One promises disaster, the other Fantasyland. For Richard III, the fantasy was people saying it was the best since Olivier's. Well, they did. Audiences flocked, queued overnight, bartered for black market tickets. Big names travelled to Stratford to see us. Peter Brook, Michael Caine, Donald Sutherland, Charlton Heston. Mom and Dad happened to be at the same matinee as Heston and shared the VIP room at the interval. This made more impact on Dad than the show, through which he'd slept soundly. And he went round for days afterwards, shamelessly name-dropping, I had tea with Moses.
Of course, he was very much a political activist too, and this informed his Shylock particularly. The Shylock was very Jewish. He spoke Hebrew. He chanted in Hebrew in his Shylock, and he was very exciting in the parable of Jacob and the sheep. But I particularly remember a particular performance of this. The second time I saw it, in all the performances, in the scene when he said, "You have among you many a purchased slave," he dragged forward a cowering young black actor from among the onlookers to illustrate his point. But he did that with particular force at the birthday performance that year, when the South African ambassador was in the stalls, and he pulled this black man and pointed at the South African ambassador. It caused waves around the auditorium and in the local newspaper afterwards. This was a daring and politically outspoken thing to do. So he was able to bring his private beliefs into public prominence through his performance in that particular case.
And you know, Tiffany, when we're thinking about what we saw him in and how we reacted, following on with what Stanley's just said, every time I went to see him from the first time onwards, I had that sense of, this is going to be an exciting performance, because he always had something to show, something original to say about the part, to present about the character. You knew you were going to see something which had been really carefully thought through.
Indeed,
and because when I first came to Stratford-upon-Avon, I was living with two people from Cape Town. They knew all about Antony Sher. So for a couple of years before I even saw him perform, I was very aware of his political edge as actor. And Stanley's mentioned the Shylock, and we mentioned Richard III a moment ago. On the same page as the picture of Richard, you can see him as the drag queen in Torch Song Trilogy at the bottom of that page. And look how extraordinary the makeup is. Now, he won the Olivier Award for Richard III, and I was told at the birthday lunch by someone who heard his acceptance speech that in being awarded it, he said he thinks I'm the first person to receive the Olivier Award for playing a king and a queen, because he was playing a drag queen around about the same time.
Yeah.
Wow. So you have both talked so interestingly, partly about the extraordinary physicality of his performances, and partly about the way his character and his beliefs shaped some of the decisions he made. So I wonder if we can think more about those two things, take them separately. I'm thinking about those really physical early performances. As he developed over time and obviously grew older, do you think the physicality changed? And do you think he started approaching Shakespeare in a slightly different way? I'm thinking of Falstaff or some of his later performances.
Well, I would wish to say, in response to that, Tiffany, that it might be helpful to think of his King Leontes as a transition point in his approach to Shakespeare, if this is a theory that we wish to enflesh and find illustration for and think about. And by that I mean that it was physically very thrilling to watch the Leontes, but not because of, immense acrobatic skill, but because of his physical gesture, his eyes, his ways of relating to the audience, and his interiority, especially in those final scenes. But there was a breathtaking stunt in the Leontes, and it came on the line just before Hermione's arraignment. So she's been taken out, and we hear the line, "For as she has been publicly accused, so shall she have a just and open trial." And then he just fell backward and landed crash on his back. And it was breathtaking. It's like, how have you done that? How have you not injured yourself, Tony Sher, by allowing us that close to how you want us to see Leontes's physical self change because of how he's treating Hermione? And that role took us on a physical journey from the through the play, and by the time you get to Act 5, with the longest guilt trip in all of literature, with Paulina with him, he is more and more, as it were, visionary. He's calmer. There's a revealed grace in the way that he's speaking the lines. And he went over to stage left at one point and sat on the floor with his knees against him, holding a prayer book. And Paulina, and the closeness of that relationship was so important. He was so reliant on her, so dependent, goes over to him, and he speaks these lines: "Stars, stars, and all eyes else, dead coals." And when he said "stars, stars," you knew he was seeing Hermione. That's what he allowed us to see him seeing in the way he spoke that one line of Shakespeare. And his emphasis on consonants was extremely important to him. I would wish to say almost like razor-edged constant consonants and long vowel sounds to really open up the language. And it was stars, stars, and all eyes else, dead coals.
It's a line that
the S's really just lifted the whole thing.
It's a line that I remember John Gielgud making a great deal of too in a performance which I saw in London. It's a wonderful, extraordinary line, and that's the mark of a great actor, isn't it? Partly to be able to let you into the language of the plays that they're speaking, to make you more appreciative of the art of the dramatist as well as the art of the actor. It requires a sort of generosity of spirit, and I think Tony had that, and it comes out. Of course, as time went on, he was playing older parts. He was playing less athletically demanding parts, or at least in a less athletically demanding way. So the two late performances that one thinks of course, are as the Falstaff and the Lear. But
did you want to talk a bit about the Falstaff, Tiffany? Maybe because he was physically using his. His own body was very much part of the characterization. His gait, his slow movements, convinced us of the weight of Falstaff, as well as the costuming, of course.
Absolutely. I suppose yes, I was imposing on the questions in a sense, my own memories of kind of his massive physical early performances, and then equally physical, but sort of much more confined to the body in later life. And I thought that, maybe less about the big space of the stage, but very, very much about the characters. So I just wondered.
I felt at the time, and I felt so since having watched both parts of Henry IV recently, that the Falstaff, the way Tony handles those lines, and they are not easy lines, every single word is understood. And this is part of how he operates with Shakespeare especially. But it's almost as if he's able to stand partly to one side of the language and hold it up to us and say, now look, this is my character and I'm interested in this, and surely you are as well, because you care about people, you care about characters. That's why you've come to the theatre this evening. And that's what I mean about inspiring empathy in us. And when you listen to the Falstaff, the language is just like as if it's got open arms, or he's pushing it up and outwards all the time. His voice never lands on a downward inflection at the end of a sentence. It's always the language is just served up. And there's I think it's the beginning of the Gad's Hill scene when he enters, and it's a great sort of Tony voice moment when he's repeating the name Poins, but he makes the name Poins last for ages, and he said it 3 times. Poins. Points, and then he says something else, and he comes back to another repeated points. Of course, he gets a laugh, and he achieved many moments of laughter as Falstaff. I mean, I don't think he dropped a catch really, and I was delighted to be reminded of just how much the audience was laughing, as it were, because of how he was speaking the part and making us understand the part. Really crystal clear, and I think that, and all the eyes as Falstaff. So act more with your eyes. Now the eyes with Falstaff were much warmer. It was almost as if he was inviting us to sit around a real fire with him while he spoke Shakespeare too, as there was a kind of coziness about the expression. He was smiling quite a bit as Falstaff, and it was a great contrast to the great tragic roles that he'd so fully embodied: Iago, Macbeth, Titus Andronicus.
And then there was the Lear, which followed, of course, with a totally contrasting role, which he also makes a wonderful thing of. In fact, the Lear is profoundly moving performance, isn't it? Of course, when you're seeing performances on video, it's a different experience, isn't it, from actually seeing them in the theatre. You're seeing them at one remove on a video, but nevertheless, those videos are extraordinarily valuable records of the performances, and it's particularly good that the ones we have of Tony in those great roles are live performances, not as, for example, the Olivia Othello is done in a studio. Tony's there with the audience. You're getting the audience reactions.
I'll just add a footnote, if I may, though, about the Macbeth. There will be an archive video recording of the Macbeth in the Swan in the Shakespeare Centre, but there was a film hastily made of it when they took it down to the Roundhouse, and the film is very, very different to the stage show. So I just add that as a caveat in case people rush out and watch the film. I'm sorry they didn't, as it was, straightforwardly shoot very well it taking place on the Swan stage.
Should we mention the Primo Levi, Paul? I know which you.
Oh, well, that's. I mean, where there are so many Tonys in his list of roles. So Stanley's already talked about the Shylock, and of course he was in Singer. But of course, the other great, as it were, Jewish role was Primo, based on if Primo Levi's memoir, if This Is a Man, and Tony produced a one-man show based on Primo. It lasted an hour and a half. It was at the National Theatre, and elsewhere. It was filmed not in the National though. It was filmed was it the Almeida? I think it was filmed in the Almeida. and it's available very easily on DVD. It lasts about an hour and a half, and it's Levy's words, but Tony produced this astonishing script from a massively famous memoir, and this is Tony's account of writing and producing Primo. And it just is like another illustration that there are book-length studies of Richard III, Titus Andronicus in collaboration with Greg Doran, Falstaff, King Lear, Primo, and he talks, I think, in this book about being addicted to writing.
And of course, he was a novelist too. He was a very remarkable, multi-talented man, and this comes through in his writings and his painting as well. A series of paintings that he did.
This parts of this book and the journey through this particular role, Tiffany, reveals some of the cost involved of being a great actor. And for Tony in this book, it's stage fright. And the book takes you on a journey through not only writing Primo, but basically Primo and his connection with it, helping him to conquer or control stage fright. So he starts to think about Primo when he's having that extraordinary successful season, which became known as the Jacobean season in 2002 in The Swan, in which he played Domitian Caesar in The Roman Actor and the title role in The Malcontent. But at the same time, I've been nursing a secret problem, stage fright. This first started while I was in recovery from cocaine addiction in 1996, but it seems to be getting steadily worse now. Apparently it's not uncommon as actors get older. Olivier had it so badly while he was running the National that he had to instruct the company never to meet his eyes while they were on stage with him. For me, during the Jacobeans, this thing that I've dubbed the fear has been quite merciless. Practically every performance is done to the accompaniment of 3 babbling voices. The first is my own, speaking the lines. The second is an inner demon telling me I'm going to fuck up. And the third is an inner angel telling the demon to fuck off. And the inside of my head gets quite noisy. And that sense of there being several selves all at the same time, I think this comes with great artists, because great artists are able to recognize the different selves coexisting and to name them and to be interested in several at once. And he goes on to say, so the big question is this: if you're currently suffering from chronic stage fright, is it a good idea to write yourself a one-man show? Which, of course, he does.
And it's a remarkable virtuoso performance. So it's an hour and a half of only Tony, isn't it?
It is. It's amazing.
It's an amazing soliloquy.
It's harrowing.
With no adventitious aids. He's simply him talking and being the character whose script he's speaking.
He rather jumped into writing Primo, with such enthusiasm without having permission from the Levy estate. And he says about this that was a good thing, because it meant that he didn't feel wasn't hampered in any way from the start. He was able to do exactly what he wanted with the memoir, and then very luckily he obtained permission to do it because it caught the attention of Nick Heitner, and then that allowed the Levy estate to grant him permission. There's a lovely paragraph when he starts writing it, the 16th of November 2002. An odd thing happened this morning. Any new piece of writing always goes straight to Greg for his opinion. Mm-hmm. But when I asked him to look at this first rough draft, he suggested that I read it aloud to him instead. It's written for one voice, so let me hear it like that. I hesitated for a long moment, then agreed. We went up to his study. The reading was not good, mainly because I couldn't get through certain sections without crying, particularly anything to do with Alberto, who is Primo's close friend in the concentration camp Auschwitz. And this was both absurd and wrong. The one thing Primo never does, is cry. If this had been an audition, I would have failed. At the end, when I finally looked up at Greg, his face was also wet with tears. And if people have not seen Primo, I think try and obtain it, try and see it.
It shows him as a great humanitarian as well as a great actor,
It's
doesn't
true.
it?
It's true. And by the end of this memoir, he very touchingly writes the letters to an imaginary Primo, dear Primo, and one of them, 17th of September, 2 years later, 2004, the show's opened. I drove over Blackfriars Bridge, a light, lovely evening, with London sprawling out lazily on either side, and felt an intense sensation of happiness. Not just that all the work seems to be paying off, but also that I stand a chance of conquering the fear on this. I've been strangely calm before each of the runs, strangely peaceful, and if I was a spiritualist, like Mum, I would have said it was your presence. Remember, that's addressed to Primo. So I think there was a close affinity, of course, because of their Judaism, and Tony wanting to do that one-man show for all sorts of reasons. But it's basically like Schindler's List. One wants to say of it, it's an international document. You know, it should be always made available by the United Nations on their website, kind of thing.
You know, what's extraordinary about this conversation is that in our attempts to get to the heart of what was that amazing thing, what made the performances so extraordinary, we've dealt with his enunciation, his physicality, his South Africanness, his Jewishness, the fact he's a novelist, the fact he's a painter, his eyes. We've gone all over the place, and as you say, it's just extraordinary that all of this was one person. And I wonder what's the, can you get your finger on what was the constant, what was the thread, what was the or was the brilliance partly that every performance was uniquely itself? I'm still trying to get at the heart of kind of what was the essence of Sher.
I think for me, and I've said this near the beginning, I mentioned it, we came back to it briefly. I think it's watching Tony's ability to be empathetic for the characters he's playing. But it's not that he only becomes those characters. There's the edge there which allows us to hear him, watch him, analysing the character at the same time, which allows us in to do the same. So it's as if the portrayal is at once truthful, but it's also conversational about the portrayal. There's something hidden but self-conscious at the same time, which it becomes a contract with the audience. And that's what I mean by him inspiring empathy in us. Now, I believe that if we become more empathetic as people, or if we use our powers of empathy, we become stronger as people, because we have an ability to step outside ourselves and imagine ourselves into other people's shoes. And that allows us to view ourselves critically through the lens of an imagined other. And therefore, watching Tony Sher, as I've done many times, and I can continue to do because of the legacy of the DVDs, makes me feel stronger as a person. The ability that he has to show me how he can be empathetic enhances that sense that I can do it myself, and then makes me feel stronger. So I would answer it something like that, Tiffany, that the through line from someone who often said he was an outsider, South African, Jewish, gay, all his life, allowed him to inspire strength in other people.
That's wonderful. And I'm wondering, again, a question for both of you. We've been talking about different productions and how extraordinary they were. I was wondering if there was a production that you'd seen more than once, and if the two versions you'd seen were different or the same. You know, that's a difficult question to ask because we're going back in time. But I just wondered if there was.
Well, I have mentioned the Merchant of Venice, where there was a difference, because in that Shakespeare birthday performance, he actually changed the dynamic so that he was addressing a single individual in the audience, which the South African ambassador, in fact, in his delegation. So this does evidence a constant freshness, fresh awareness of the audience, every particular audience. He's not just stereotypically repeating a performance irrespective of who was watching it. He's conscious of the interaction between himself and the audience on any particular night, whether it's a significant difference, as it was with the South African ambassador, or whether it is with a paid audience at every performance. The actor is constantly alert to those who are watching, hearing, and listening to him.
I saw the Leontes 4 times, and I remember the day I first saw it, which I think was maybe the second preview. So there were some changes in the production by the time it got to press night. The day after, several students from the Shakespeare there, and we were all of us just awestruck. And I remember going to see Etta and Daphne, who used to work there in the office, the administrators. And they're saying, they just said, "How are you?" I said, "I am in a state of grace." I had the wide eyes peering through the window into the office at the Institute. They said, "What?" So I saw The Winter's Tale last night. And I was just full of it, as if I'd been present at some sort of miracle. It was moving. He was heroic. Alexandra Gilbraith as Hermione was just exquisite. Estelle Kohler as Paulina was magnificent. And it was like every aspect of that production was heavenly. And fortunately, a really good DVD version of it exists and is available with some cast interviews. But I've often used that with students over the years when teaching the play. It's a gold standard of The Winter's Tale for me, that production. I've only seen one other that I'd consider having enjoyed as much, and that was Kenneth Branagh's with Judi Dench as Paulina. But I mean, Tony is he writes about it in his memoir, and I remember reading in the national press at the time, a study of morbid jealousy. And morbid jealousy, let me just find when he's writing about this in the memoir, came to his attention. Professor Maria Ron of the renowned Maudsley Hospital. I'm not sure what I expected from a professor of psychiatry, but Maria Ron is a surprising character. She tackles Leontes' case with complete certainty. He classically fits a condition known as morbid jealousy or psychotic jealousy. Descending out of the blue and mostly affecting men, the dominant symptom is a delusion that the patient's partner is betraying him. It leads to wildly obsessive behaviour, frantically searching for proof, hiring detectives and lawyers, and sometimes extreme violence. It's amazing. Every detail, every symptom is in the play. What may seem like a rather fantastical creation by Shakespeare is actually a completely realistic one. Now, of course, we know, and Tony knew, that Shakespeare does this in Merry Wives of Windsor and in Othello, but the treatment with Leontes is different from those other two, and he plays Leontes as a sick man, he says, rather than as someone who's just kind of obsessed with jealousy. And by playing him as someone who, as it were, needs treatment, he won the audience's sympathy more, I believe. And it softened the role in many ways. And it made it eminently rewatchable. And that journey I described, having witnessed watching him with Leontes, really, by the time we got to the end of that production, there's the phrase, there wasn't a dry eye in the house. The woman sitting next to me was sobbing in tears at the end. She didn't know the ending of the play, and she was just bowled over by the ending of that production. I remember dear Robert Smallwood staggering up the aisle at the end, of that production and grabbing me by the arm and saying, "You can keep your Hamlets, you can keep your Othellos, give me the Winter's Tale any day." And it really was sort of a gold standard of that play. But I mean, I loved going to see. I saw Macbeth 3 times. I saw Death of a Salesman 3 times. Death of a Salesman's an interesting one because it was a sort of preparation for King Lear, but as it were through the common man, Willie Loman. And of course, it was an echo for theatre-going audiences of the Macbeth, because Harriet Walter was playing opposite Tony in Death of a Salesman as well. But I think in some interesting ways it anticipated the Lear, because Tony brought a down-to-earthness to his Lear, which was varied by design choices to remind us of majestic, as it were, Stonehenge-like king at various points, but there was a pulling back, a spareness with his King Lear, which just added to the sense of how moving it was, wouldn't you say?
Yeah.
And I'm wondering, so you're talking about these extraordinary performances, the sort of gold standard for those plays. I'm wondering, Stanley, as an editor, were there any particular lines that you rethought or understood differently because of a Sher performance? And sorry if that's too specific, but
well, I can't recall any at the moment. No.
Yes,
Oh,
yes, that's a very specific.
Oh, the Prospero one, yes.
We've not mentioned Prospero.
Yeah, well, we did just mention it when I said that Prospero asking Caliban for forgiveness at the end. Yeah, there are things certainly like that one, if one were writing a commentary afresh on the play, one might draw on the actor, on the intonations of the actor, and of course also on the business of the actor, because acting is not merely a matter of words. I mean, the keening that he did as Shylock, for example, is something that adds to the roundness of the character, the roundness of the performance. Yeah.
But I think if people were to watch the Falstaff DVDs, if they didn't see the part, or to be reminded if they had, every line seems freshly minted, because it's to do with his handling of the language, his serving with an upward inflection at the ends of sentences. It's truly extraordinary what he's able to do with the Falstaff, I think, with handling of the language. And it's as if the language itself is part of the mask for the actor. I'm thinking about Greek theatre for a moment, but that it was obviously so incredibly helpful for Tony. Oh, there's a lovely moment, I think, in Beside Myself, which is very relevant to what I'm just trying to articulate, but I'll let Tony articulate it instead. Page 322. There is no sensation. I mean none. Not coke, not sex, nothing like the sensation of a role starting to work, particularly if it's a great role, particularly if it's Shakespeare. That thrill when it starts coming to the boil inside, when its juices start to mingle with yours, you get a sense, a tiny sense, of what it must have been like to write these words originally. You taste them in your mouth and they taste fresh. And I think it's difficult to choose one line, because his performances are peppered through with insightful renditions of familiar speeches.
Yeah. So a question for each of you: if you could, if there were a time machine, you could go back, you can see one Sher performance, which would it be?
I think I'd like to see the Richard III again. Of course, one of the interesting things in reading Turner's writings about acting is how much he admired, indeed adored, Laurence Olivier. And there's an interesting passage in his book where he and McKellen are both talking about Olivier and both acknowledging Olivier's mastery, and what a great experience it was.
Why do you read that bit, Stanley?
Oh,
It's just
right,
not fair,
okay.
yeah.
Right.
He obviously adored Olivier. Tony Sher.
Yeah. When I was doing Uncle Vanya in 1992, playing Astroff to McKellen's Vanya, he and I became friends. During a conversation about Olivier, Ian suddenly said gloomily, "We can't match him. None of us can, ever." I looked at him in surprise. Ian was and is something of a hero to me for his political as well as his theatre work, and by then I'd come to regard him as a better actor than Olivier, more truthful, more dangerous. I must say I raised my eyebrows a bit at that. Ian's psychological studies of Shakespeare's dark characters, Iago, Richard III and Macbeth, are remarkable. They fill me with admiration and envy. It's interesting, isn't it, that the line of parts that Olivier excelled in is also the line of parts that Tony excelled in. But Olivier had the greater range. I mean, for example, Tony never did Hamlet. You can't quite see him as a Hamlet. You can't see him as
Richard II.
As Richard II, very much so. He's not a lyrical actor in that way. He could be he could encompass lyricism, as you have to do in Leontes, for example, but he's not an actor. He's not a Romeo, to give the most obvious of
I tell you what, though, if I could go back in time, we've not mentioned it so far, and I did see it once, but I'd like to see it again. Cyrano de Bergerac.
I didn't see that.
If the question is one that we'd already seen, I never saw the Richard III, so I would like to go back in time and see that. But Stanley mentions Romeo, and of course that made me think of Cyrano, the great lover. But of course it's the great lover who's hiding behind a mask. He's hiding himself, but the words do everything. So the words and the ability to let us in to his heart and his mind, that Roxanne falls in love with, not his appearance. And Roxanne was Alexandra Gilbraith in that production. I think it was the first time Greg directed Tony. I saw it in The Swan, and it was captivating, and it was physically impressive, and he was made up with the longish nose and so on. But oh my goodness, yes, the Cyrano was. Well, I remember just being bowled over by it. I think it was marvelous.
But of course, this is the second time we've been talking about also the Greg effect. I mean, that powerful duo was so inspiring to one another. I think that's one of the extraordinary things that also we need to add into the mix.
We do. I mean, I happen to, because they live around the corner. They live around the corner from me, and I happen to know that during lockdown, I popped around to deliver something a couple of times, and Tony was writing short stories. Greg said during lockdown, the first lockdown. So
the restless intelligence.
Yeah. But yeah, the writing was very important to him, and the painting, of course. And there's some extraordinary paintings, really. When some of them are reproduced in here. There's one that Greg has called The Audience, which is an immense canvas of looking out onto an auditorium, but imagining figures sitting in the seats. I probably can't find it just as I'm talking about it, but I think it's reproduced.
It's all to do with the sort
there
of...
it is. Just gives you a sense, and the more you read them, the more you can recognise some of them. It's called The Audience. So that to want to paint that as your subject is again revealing these many selves. The mind is just able to inhabit and go to lots of different demanding spaces.
And also how responsive to audience he was, how conscious of audiences. Yes, absolutely.
It's to do with a sort of introversion becoming extroversion. He needs to look greatly into himself, as he does in the novels, in the painting and the writing in order to push himself to understand the other people that he's portraying on stage too, isn't it? Isn't there something of that?
I'm sure that's right, Stanley. And you know, this book, which we've been quoting from,
Mm.
is worth everyone having a copy of.
Because there was, I think, a somewhat introverted character. He wasn't flamboyant in real life at all. He was quiet, modest, gently spoken.
That's right.
He?
And also, the first time I sort of properly met him was at the Shakespeare Institute. I was chairing the Actors Forum for the International Shakespeare Conference in 2002. It was the year he was playing Roman Actor and the Malcontent. And you know, he was so good at being able to talk about what he was doing on stage. Very, very articulate, because of, and this obviously is manifest in the writings itself. But it was so potentially intimidating for me to be on that same platform as Tony Sher, whose work I'd quoted in my essays, for goodness sakes, and there he was, and I just remember really enjoying being with him and him putting me at my ease, really. I remember seeing him on Marylebone Station just after Greg was appointed artistic director. And I just said to Tony, Tony, I am so happy. I'm so happy for both of you. And he beamed at me. He was about to catch a train. He beamed at me and he said, Paul, the RSC have decided that the way Greg has been directing Shakespeare for all these years is the way they want to go on directing Shakespeare. And that was wonderful to hear that from Tony. That's my best Tony impression.
Right. I did want to ask you, as we're coming to a close, whether you had any Tony anecdotes. That might be yours.
That's probably my one, by two.
Yes. Have you any, Stanley?
Well, no, except what I said about the painting, the portrait. That was. But it doesn't crystallize into a single anecdote.
Did you have to sit still, sort of while?
No, I didn't. You see, well, I had to say I was sitting just in my normal way, but he wasn't painting me. He didn't paint me while I was in his presence. He took photographs. He painted me, I suppose, within his own mind, but all the painting was done in his own studio. It's not at all like one imagines a portrait painter. Well, for example, when I had my bust done, as it were, sounds rather rude, doesn't it? But Greg Wyatt, the sculptor, made a bust of me, and there I did have to sit in his studio, had 4 long 2-hour sittings while he molded his clay and molded my face out of his clay. And that's the other work of art portraying me, which is also mouldering in the Shakespeare Centre.
I remember, though, the day that Greg and Tony came to see Diana Owen, who was the director of the Shakespeare Birthplace Trust, and me on commissioning Tony's portrait of Stanley, for Stanley's
80th.
Was it your 80th, Stanley? I think it was, wasn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah. No. It was when you were retiring as chairman.
Oh, was it? Oh,
it was 2011.
Oh, right. Okay.
That was the occasion.
Roundabout, so.
And it was just really, we knew that it was a significant commission was taking place. We knew that a great actor was going to be painting a great Shakespearean. And I'm so pleased the Birthplace Trust, decided to do that, because it's always going to remain, an interesting portrait, however you approach it, isn't it? Yeah.
Yes. How wonderful. Well, yes, how wonderful for both of you. But I do rather envy you, Stanley Caddup, having Tony Sher sort of staring at you and sketching you and taking little pictures of you.
His eyes. Stars, all eyes.
Well, we just have a couple of minutes left. So I wonder what are the last words you want to, is there anything else, anything we haven't covered yet? Or the final observations you'd like to make just before we wrap up? And I do want to thank you so much. This has been enormously enjoyable and so enlightening.
Well, it has been enjoyable. I mean, I think I would just, I suppose my final words are that to be asked to do this session with you and Stanley in the context of the Equality Shakespeare Festival is an enormous privilege and pleasure for me. I feel unworthy to be doing it, but I'm really pleased to have contributed to a sort of memorial portrait of a great actor.
Well, Paul, you've spoken very, very eloquently and very wisely about Tony. I think I would want to stress the modesty of the man, which nevertheless produces, through a sort of extroversion of the modesty, which produces the enormous range of characters that he's able to portray. We've concentrated on Shakespeare. He played other people. He played Stanley Spencer. He played a number of actual real people.
Edmund Kean.
He played Henry Irving briefly.
Vindice in The Revenger's Tragedy.
No, but also real people. I'm thinking of the fact that he
played Michelangelo.
I saw him play Stanley Spencer. That was at the National Theatre. And as one went into the theatre, there was Tony painting, interestingly enough, on the wall, on the back wall of the theatre, being a Stanley Spencer painting.
I'd like to see that as well. I'd like to have seen him as Stanley Spencer, written by Pam Gems.
Yeah, well, but so there's the enormous range of characters that he portrays, but all through the empathetic power of an actor, able to project his own personality, or to view his own personality into the understanding, the sympathetic understanding of the range of people, fictional and real people, whose words he is using as an actor on stage and occasionally on film too.
That's Disraeli in Mrs. Brown, for example.
So, well, it's been a privilege to be able to try, however imperfectly, to articulate some of the thoughts that we've had about Tony, and to pay tribute and to express gratitude for all that he's given us and that he continues to give us through the books and through the recorded performances, the film performances too. So his legacy lives on.
It does indeed. Thank you so much, Stanley. Thank you, Paul. And thank you, memory of Antony Sher. Thank you.
Bravo, Sir Antony Sher.
Bravo.